This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Minnie Williams dreamed of being a star. Having acted in plays in her hometown of Dallas, Texas, and being told repeatedly how talented she was, she figured Broadway to be in her future. But she always found a reason to stay. Also, she was still a kid, barely 20 years old. She had all the time in the world. Minnie's mother had died when Minnie was still a child, and her father, a successful doctor, had raised her and her brother and sister. It wasn't until her father died unexpectedly that Minnie, now an orphan at 21, decided to go follow her dreams. Her father had left her a nice inheritance, not enough to retire, but enough to be comfortable until she could make her own way. The inheritance included a savings account, plus some stocks and bonds that were sold, and the proceeds were divided among Minnie and her siblings. But there was also a real estate portfolio that included property in Fort Worth that provided a monthly income, also divided among her siblings. She had the means, barely, but she had the means to give it one good shot in New York. So Minnie Williams shuttered the fledgling theater company she had started in Dallas and booked a one-way train ticket to Manhattan. But when she arrived, she realized that the landscape of live theater in New York was shifting beneath her feet, with the early days of vaudeville completely taking over. This new, still developing style of entertainment didn't align with Minnie's skill set, and she was back in Texas within a year. However, her hopes were revived when she heard about the World's Columbian Exposition that would be held in Chicago the following year, and she knew in her heart that her destiny awaited. Plus, she had actually met a man in New York who told her that he would be relocating to Chicago because of the World's Fair, and to look him up if she was ever in town. Everything seemed to fall into place. She had enough money to survive. The city of Chicago was about to be overflowing with opportunity, and she knew someone. Sure, one person in the whole city, but sometimes that's all you need. Her friend from New York was named Edward Hatch, but in Chicago, he went by a different name, Dr. H. Holmes. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Part 2 of Homegrown Horror. When Minnie Williams arrived in Chicago, she made a beeline for the pharmacy owned by Holmes. It's unclear how the two were able to reestablish contact given his new name, but regardless, not only was Minnie warmly welcomed by Holmes, he offered her a job as his personal stenographer, which she gladly accepted. By this point, Holmes' second wife had gotten wise and left him, but they were still technically married. He was, in fact, still married to his first wife as well. As you might expect, things between Holmes and Minnie became romantic in short order, and the two began living together as, to quote Minnie, husband and wife. Remember, Minnie was already 24 years old and still single. That was considered ancient in 1893. I mean, she might as well pack it in and become a spinster. Suffice it to say, Minnie had a serious reputational interest in asserting that she and the good doctor were married. And Holmes was by now a seasoned con man. If she wanted to play husband and wife, then she better act like it. And that meant signing over her inherited real estate holdings to him. And she did. Holmes also offered to look after Minnie's 18-year-old younger sister if she could be convinced to come to Chicago. The offer was accepted, and soon the younger Williams, her name was Nanny, was living in the guest room of the apartment. And this is where things began to turn bad for the Williams sisters. According to one account, early in Nanny's time in Chicago, there was one particular night that Minnie was required to be out of town. She asked her, quote, husband if he would be willing to look after Nanny in her absence. It was an absurd request, asked more out of a religious, conservative sense of moral righteousness, just keeping up appearances. Nanny didn't need a babysitter, and everyone involved knew that, but it was a custom. It was expected, and it kept Minnie happy by perpetuating the facade of a real marriage. But as soon as Minnie was out the door, Holmes looked at Nanny and was like, "You're good?" And she was all, "Of course, I'm a grown-up." And he left to spend the night playing cards and drinking. He was, after all, a guy in his 30s who had a night off from the wife. The problem was, he spent the night in a spare room at the bar. So when his wife came home, she saw that only one bed in the apartment had been slept in, and she immediately assumed the worst. And of course, she didn't blame her husband. I mean, he's only human after all. No, she blamed her sister for the assumed infidelity and promptly murdered her by bashing her skull in with a kitchen chair. When Holmes returned, he was horrified at what his, quote, wife had done. But as a good husband, he chose to protect her by getting rid of the body and even forging a series of letters to extended family that Nanny had moved to Europe. Unfortunately for Minnie, her younger brother Baldwin, then age 22, would also meet an untimely end shortly after Nanny died. His accidental drowning came as a shock to everyone, as he famously wasn't able to swim and would never willingly go near any body of water. All the same, his life insurance policy, which Minnie didn't know existed, paid out handsomely, and that money, of course, went to her husband. Cool story, right? Also, a complete fantasy concocted by Holmes in an attempt to save his skin. The real story, according to law enforcement, is most likely that Minnie never even knew that her little sister had arrived in Chicago, and that as soon as Nanny arrived, Holmes attacked her, took all her money, and sealed her up in one of his airtight murder chambers in his renovated third-floor hotel, where she suffocated. Pieces of Nanny's body would be found years later, buried in the secret underground vault Holmes has constructed beneath the basement of his hotel. As for the younger brother, Baldwin, well, it seems that Holmes himself had persuaded the young man to buy a life insurance policy before he set off on an adventure tour of the U.S. Indian Territories, something rich men did back in the day. Baldwin agreed and named his older sister Minnie as the beneficiary. Holmes then took a few days off from the pharmacy, hopped on a train to Oklahoma, tracked down Baldwin, poisoned him, and then threw him in a pond where he drowned. Minnie got the insurance money, which meant that Holmes got the insurance money. There's also much more to Minnie's story, which we'll get to in a moment, but I wanted to point out an interesting fact about H.H. Holmes, the murderer. While not unique, it's rare for a serial killer to be completely motivated by greed. All of Holmes's murders were either in furtherance of some kind of monetary gain, to continue an established con that was paying out, or to prevent someone from ratting him out for a devious money-making scam. It was all about money for Holmes, which separates him from the sexually motivated killers. Killers looking to prove their sexual prowess that, in one way or another, had caused them shame or embarrassment early in life. Holmes didn't need to kill to feel powerful. He already was powerful in his ability to use his mind to trick people into giving up their money. And he didn't need to kill to prove himself sexually. He always seemed to be surrounded by pretty girls. He married 3 times and fathered 2 children. Did he remain that scared yet fascinated boy who found a strange peace while in the presence of a human skeleton? Did his obsession with death continue into adulthood? Or was he just a dangerous narcissist, a sociopath who didn't have the brakes governing his morality that most people do, the brakes that stop us from purposely crashing a car in a fit of road rage, or stop us from punching the idiot in line ahead of us that's making everyone late, or the brakes that prevent you from murdering someone who might expose an embarrassing or even criminal misstep. Holmes didn't have those brakes. He didn't have the sense that murder was wrong, and he didn't seem to have a problem torturing human beings and employing several different manners of taking someone's life. Yes, Minnie would also lose her life to Dr. Holmes. So, with the Williams parents already deceased, effectively, H.H. Holmes, in murdering all 3 of their children, wiped out the family bloodline single-handedly. But things with Minnie got weird. She remained at his side through clever and disturbing manipulation tactics, and even still claimed to be his wife. By this time, the World's Fair had ended, and police were very interested in the goings-on at Holmes' hotel, a subject we'll cover in the next episode. But for now, we'll stick with Holmes, Minnie, and their movements in the year after they left Chicago. So early in his time in Chicago, Holmes befriended a man named Benjamin Petezel. Petezel was, more or less, a career criminal who sometimes took legitimate work as a carpenter, but he was always looking for an angle or a scam. He was smart enough to know that he wasn't as smart as Holmes, and so the decision to fall in with the charismatic doctor as his basically criminal assistant was an easy one. The two allegedly conspired in dozens of schemes while still in Chicago, but those chickens were coming home to roost. Several insurance companies wanted Holmes prosecuted for arson with intent to fraudulently collect payments, and the decision was made to get the hell out of there. Minnie suggested Fort Worth. After all, that's where the property was located that her father had left her, that she subsequently signed over to Holmes. Up to his old tricks, Holmes attempted to build a large structure for mixed-use purposes without paying anyone for their services, labor, or materials. But things didn't go as planned, and they were forced to leave Texas much sooner than anticipated. The trio, Holmes, Minnie, and Petezel, next landed in St. Louis, where Holmes came up with a scheme to fake his own death. Have Minnie produce a corpse that he would steal from a graveyard. She would then collect the insurance money, he would change his name, and they would enjoy the proceeds from the scam. Holmes found a lawyer willing to participate, and the plan was set in motion. But it didn't work. The insurance company grew more and more suspicious. The corpse provided by Minnie didn't really match the physical description of her supposedly deceased husband. Ultimately, they refused to pay. And again, the trio hit the road, this time for Philadelphia, where now it would be Petezel faking his own death, and the insurance money would go to his wife. Yeah, he had a wife this whole time, who stayed in Chicago taking care of their 5 children. The grift called for Petezel to pretend to be an inventor, who then gets grievously wounded and disfigured in a lab explosion that leads to his death. That description would make it much easier to find a suitable corpse to fit the bill. It didn't have to look exactly like Petezel. But just to be completely sure that the insurance company would pay out, you know what Holmes did? He figured, fuck it, and actually murdered his best friend, Benjamin Petezel, in September of 1894. He used chloroform to knock him out and then set him on fire. Even though it was no longer necessary, Holmes still stuck to the script about Petezel being an inventor and being killed in a lab explosion. And it worked. Of course it worked. It was the actual dead guy. The insurance was collected as a result of that, the actual Petezel corpse being offered as proof of the loss. Then, if it's even possible, things got worse. Through more of Holmes's cruel and cunning manipulation, Holmes was able to convince Petezel's widow that Petezel was in fact still alive and in hiding in London because of criminal deeds, and Holmes was helping him to cover him up, so, you're welcome. but it would be better off if she granted custody of her 3 youngest children to Holmes and his wife, Minnie. In reality, Holmes didn't care one bit about those kids, but he understood that the optics of a man and woman traveling with kids looked a lot better and aroused less suspicion with the potential marks as they scammed their way north from Philly. It wasn't long before the mother of the 3 Petezel children began asking questions, as she hadn't heard from them in weeks. By this point, Holmes and his, quote, family had made it all the way to Toronto, where Holmes rented a house and made plans to tie up some of his loose ends. As far as anyone knew, at this point, Holmes wasn't aware that ever since Philadelphia, detectives from local police, as well as the world-famous Pinkerton Detective Agency, had been tracking him and were closing in. Maybe Holmes felt the heat around the corner because he decided to streamline his operation. In late October of 1894, H. Holmes forced the 2 oldest Petezel children, sisters Alice and Nellie, ages 13 and 9, into an old steamer trunk and locked it. He then cut a small hole in the trunk and inserted a tube that fed natural gas into the space, asphyxiating the girls. He then buried the bodies in the basement of his Toronto home. Before the Pinkertons picked up the scent of Holmes, it was a Philadelphia police detective named Frank Geyer who always seemed to be just a few steps behind. It was Geyer who tracked Holmes to Toronto, but Holmes and company were already gone. He did find several letters written by the Petezel children to their mother, letters that obviously Holmes never sent. These letters led Geyer to a home in Indianapolis, but again, he was too late. Holmes, Minnie Williams, and the only remaining Petezel child, a 9-year-old boy named Howard, arrived in Indianapolis in early November and would stay less than a week. It's unclear how Holmes arranged for lodging, but he always seemed to make something work. In their short time in Indianapolis, Holmes befriended a local pharmacist who would get Holmes some specific medicines off the books, dangerous narcotics that Holmes would use to dispatch with young Howard Petezel. Once dead from a massive drug overdose, Holmes would dismember the body and burn it. Detective Geyer would later find several of the boy's teeth in the fireplace of the home in Indianapolis. It was in this house where Holmes also claimed to have finally killed Minnie as well. Now, there has been speculation that her death was actually accidental, which would be unique in the timeline of H. Holmes, but there is an argument to be made. Holmes kept Minnie alive far longer than anyone else he spent significant time with. She obviously was an asset to his operation. How is exactly unclear, but she was definitely considered valuable. But kids were no longer welcome. The speculation is that Minnie became pregnant and Holmes attempted an abortion that went wrong, as many did during that time, and Minnie died as a result. There were other alleged female victims of Holmes that may have suffered the same fate, but that was one aspect of his crime spree that he refused to discuss. Minnie's body was never found, but Holmes confessed to killing her by means of chloroform and asphyxiation and then concealing her body in a cellar. The specific cellar was never conveyed to investigators by Holmes. Holmes is suspected of dozens of more killings that we'll discuss in the next episode, including the planning and construction of his terrifying, quote, murder castle during the World's Fair. His time with Minnie Williams and the Petezel killings are an important part of his story, as those few months on the road following his departure from Chicago would provide the only evidence that ever resulted in a conviction. But man, wait till you hear about that murder castle. On the next episode of The Devil Within, we take a deep dive into the chilling house of horrors created by H.H. Holmes that played host to dozens of helpless victims during one of the most important periods in the history of Chicago. Plus, the Pinkertons track Holmes to Boston, where he makes his final stand. That's next week on The Devil Within. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.